Before dead, Paul Reubens admitted the truth of relationship with Phil Hartman. I went into this story expecting a Hollywood friendship that simply fell apart. Instead, I found something much harder to explain. Because Paul Reubens eventually talked about Phil Hartman with affection, regret, and even gratitude, but never gave us the neat reconciliation story we usually expect. And the strangest part? By the time Paul was finally ready to talk about it, Phil was no longer there to answer. Paul Reubens spent years protecting parts of his life. The man behind Pee Wee Herman could be incredibly open in character, yet surprisingly private as himself. That makes what he eventually revealed about Phil Hartman so interesting. Not because it was some secret romance, not because there was one dramatic argument that explained everything. It was messier than that. These two men helped build each other's careers, and then they stopped being friends. The beginning actually feels almost too innocent. Before Pee Wee's Big Adventure, before Saturday Night Live, before either man became a household name, Paul and Phil were performers in Los Angeles. Phil Hartman had joined the Groundlings and quickly became known as someone who could walk into a chaotic comedy scene and somehow make it work. Paul was developing Pee Wee, and Phil became Captain Carl. That pairing was almost perfect. Pee Wee was unpredictable. Captain Carl wasn't. And somehow, that made the whole thing funnier. I think that's what people sometimes forget about comedy partnerships. The person holding the scene together can be just as important as the person getting the biggest laugh. Phil understood that. Paul understood Phil. And eventually, the friendship became something much bigger than a stage act. When Paul couldn't get the break he wanted from Saturday Night Live, he went another direction. He created his own show. The Pee Wee Herman Show became a huge success, and Phil was part of the world that made it work. Then came the bicycle. Paul had an idea for a movie built around Pee Wee's stolen red bicycle. He, Phil Hartman, and Michael Varhol worked on the screenplay. They weren't experienced Hollywood screenwriters sitting in some glamorous office. They were essentially figuring it out as they went. Paul bought a screenwriting book. They used index cards. They put the story together piece by piece. And somehow, it became Pee Wee's Big Adventure. That's one of my favorite parts of this entire story. Because you can almost picture them standing around that bulletin board, trying to figure out where the bicycle disappears and where it eventually comes back. At that point, neither man could possibly know how much their lives were about to change. Paul became a major star, and Phil got another opportunity through him. When Pee Wee hosted Saturday Night Live, Paul helped bring Phil and John Paragon into the writing process. Lorne Michaels noticed Phil, and Phil eventually joined the cast. That changed everything. Suddenly, the man who had been Captain Carl was doing impressions, playing completely different characters, and becoming one of the most versatile performers on television. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because success changed the friendship. Phil believed his contributions to Pee Wee had not always received the recognition he deserved. Paul, meanwhile, had legitimate reasons to feel ownership over the character and the world he had created. Both things could be true. That's important. It wasn't necessarily a story where one person was completely right and the other completely wrong. It was two creative people who had built something together and eventually disagreed over what that creation meant. Then came 1991. Paul's arrest became a massive public scandal. The image of Pee Wee Herman changed almost overnight. And during that difficult period, Paul reached out to Phil. They had been apart for years. But apparently, when everything else became uncertain, Paul remembered the person who had known him before the fame became enormous. That detail really stayed with me. Because when people are embarrassed or frightened, they often don't call the most successful person they know. They think about the person who knew them before they became successful. Phil later spoke publicly about their estrangement. He acknowledged that professional disagreements were part of what had happened. But he also described Paul as an extraordinary talent. That contradiction is important, because apparently, even after the friendship was damaged, the admiration didn't completely disappear. And then, in 1998, Phil Hartman died unexpectedly at 49. Whatever chance the two men had of sitting down and working everything out disappeared with him. There would be no final conversation, no perfectly written apology, no Hollywood ending, just memories. Years later, Paul was still carrying them. During his final period of interviews, filmmaker Matt Wolf explored Paul's life in extraordinary depth. Paul talked about things he had kept private for decades: his sexuality, his relationships, his fears, his career, the complicated relationship between Paul Reubens and Pee Wee Herman. But when the conversation reached Phil, there were limits. Paul didn't seem interested in turning a dead friend into a villain. And he didn't pretend everything had been repaired either. That distinction matters. Eventually, Paul spoke about Phil in a way I find incredibly revealing. He remembered the friendship. He remembered what Phil contributed. He remembered the opportunities, and he admitted that he still thought about him. That may not sound like a dramatic confession, but honestly, I think it's more powerful because it isn't. Paul didn't invent a reconciliation that never happened. He didn't erase the resentment. He didn't erase Phil's complaints. He didn't erase his own side of the story. He simply admitted that the man still mattered. And that's a very human thing. Sometimes a friendship doesn't end because you stop caring. Sometimes it ends because pride, money, distance, misunderstanding, and hurt pile up until neither person knows how to climb over them. Then time passes,